For 11 days, a single document sat on the papal desk in Rome. It was close enough to be touched, yet too dangerous to be rushed. Inside it were decades of complaints, altered prayers, private warnings, unanswered letters, and a growing concern that the Church could no longer treat as a local issue. This was not ordinary paperwork. It was something that had been building quietly across continents, in parishes, in dioceses, and in silence. A cardinal would later read the final version and break down in tears. Another would leave the room without a single word. Then, on the morning of the 29th of May 2026, Pope Leo XIV picked up his pen and signed. This was not a sermon, not a suggestion, not a pastoral reflection meant to be debated and set aside. It was a decree, and behind that signature stood a question the Vatican had avoided for years. What happens when the very words at the heart of the Mass are quietly changed, over time, by priests who believe they are helping their people? The crisis did not begin with the Pope. It began before Rome was fully awake. At 6:47 inches the morning, Archbishop Lorenzo Fattori's phone rang just after his morning prayers. But it wasn't a routine call. It came through the Vatican switchboard, the kind of line that carried instructions rather than conversation. On the other end was Cardinal Arthur Rowe, prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship. His voice was calm, controlled, and already carrying urgency without needing to say it. He did not offer greetings. He did not explain. He simply delivered the message. The Holy Father wanted the liturgy file. Everything they had. Fattori did not ask why. Inside the Vatican, experience teaches a simple rule: when the Pope requests a file, questions slow things down. He understood immediately what was expected of him. Speed, not discussion. He crossed his office, opened the third cabinet on the left, and pulled out a thick folder that had been growing quietly for months. It was heavier than it looked, not just in paper, but in meaning. This file had not appeared suddenly. It had accumulated piece by piece, complaint after complaint, report after report, until it stopped looking like administration and started looking like evidence. Its contents reflected something Rome could no longer ignore. Before it reached the Pope's desk, this file would pass through a chain of tension. A closed meeting, a 7-2-hour drafting struggle, urgent phone calls across Europe, and a private confrontation in the papal office. But at its core, the crisis began with something simple and unsettling: a locked cabinet, a growing file, and a Pope who had decided that silence was no longer acceptable. The first call had reached Archbishop Fattori at 6:47 sharp. The Vatican offices were only just beginning their daily rhythm. He had just finished prayers when the phone rang again, this time not from a colleague, but from the central switchboard itself. That detail mattered. Calls routed through that system were never casual. They came with purpose. On the line was Cardinal Arthur Rowe once more, speaking with precision, not emotion. The instruction was repeated. The Holy Father required the liturgy file in full. Fattori froze for half a second, not out of confusion, but recognition. Certain voices in the Vatican don't require explanation, they require action. He walked to the cabinet, unlocked it, and removed the folder. Inside, the weight of the situation was already visible. The folder was thick, worn at the edges, and carefully organized, but what stood out most were the red tabs, 64 of them, each marking a report, a complaint, or a case that could not be dismissed as isolated. And this was only what had been officially documented across 22 countries. What lay inside those pages was not just administrative concern. It was a pattern spreading quietly across the global Church. The accumulation had begun years earlier, but it intensified after the January consistory, when Pope Leo XIV met with cardinals from across the world. Those meetings covered evangelization, synodality, episcopal responsibility, and the Church's future direction. But there was one subject he did not engage publicly: liturgy, or more precisely, what was happening to it. For some, his silence was confusing. For others, it was telling. In Vatican terms, silence from a pope is rarely absence, it is preparation. Because behind that silence, reports continued to arrive, and they were becoming harder to ignore. The file that now sat in Vatican offices was no longer just a collection of reports. It had become a map of something larger, something spreading quietly across the Church, without official recognition. Among the documents was a letter from a canon lawyer in Munich. It was not emotional. It was structured, precise, and legally framed. 11 pages long, it documented 93 separate instances of what it called liturgical irregularities observed over 2 years. Not rumors, not assumptions, observations. Each case listed with location, pattern, and deviation from approved liturgical texts. Archbishop Fattori read it once, then marked it with a red tab. No commentary, no reaction, just classification. Another file came through the Dicastery for Bishops, forwarded from Wisconsin. It carried a very different tone. It was written by a mother of 4. She had attended her nephew's first communion. What she saw unsettled her deeply. The priest had skipped a part of the Agnus Dei, invited lay people into the sanctuary for an improvised reflection, and altered words during the consecration. Her concern was not theological argument, it was uncertainty. She asked a simple question. Had her nephew's first communion been valid? That question stayed with Fattori longer than most reports, because it revealed something deeper than misconduct. It revealed doubt in the sacraments themselves. 3 weeks passed. Another red tab was added, then another file, then another. By the time Cardinal Rowe called again, the folder contained 64 red tabs, each one representing a situation where the boundary between official liturgy and local adaptation had been crossed. This was no longer about style or interpretation. It was about consistency, and more importantly, trust. When Rowe arrived at Fattori's office at 7:15, he did not sit down. He did not remove his coat. He simply took the summary report and read it standing by the window, as if sitting would make the information harder to process. The first question he asked was not theological, it was statistical. How many dioceses were involved? Fattori answered carefully. Reports confirmed from 22 countries. Then he added something more serious. No official wanted to write this in a permanent record, he said. The real number is likely higher. That sentence shifted the entire weight of the conversation, because it revealed the real problem was not only what was happening but what was not being recorded. Across the Church, patterns were visible but fragmented. A priest making small changes in one parish, a bishop receiving reports but treating them locally, a Vatican office seeing only partial data. Each level saw a piece, but no one saw the whole. And in that fragmentation, the issue had grown unnoticed for years. Rowe did not look surprised. That was the most concerning part. He already understood. He closed the file slowly and placed it on the desk. Then he added something that changed the direction of everything. The Pope had read pastoral letters from South America the night before. 3 bishops, 3 countries, same concern. Priests altering Eucharistic prayers so frequently that some no longer remembered the exact approved form. Fattori did not respond immediately. There was nothing useful to add. The implication was already clear enough. What had once been uniform was becoming variable, and when a prayer central to the Church becomes variable, the question is no longer administrative. It becomes sacramental. Rowe then repeated what mattered most. Pope Leo XIV had read those letters at night, and by 10:30 he had made a call to Rowe asking a single question. How long has this been happening? The room did not answer quickly because there was no simple answer. The problem stretched back decades. After the Second Vatican Council, reforms had opened space for adaptation, renewal, and pastoral flexibility. But alongside legitimate reform, another pattern slowly formed: informal changes that were never officially authorized. By 1963, Sacrosanctum Concilium had already stated clearly that no one, not even a priest, could alter the liturgy on personal authority. Yet by the 1980s, Rome was issuing clarifications. By 2000, formal studies were underway. By 2004, Redemptionis Sacramentum explicitly warned that unauthorized liturgical modification must stop. But it did not stop. That was the central reality sitting on the Pope's desk: repeated correction without full compliance. And now, In 2026, the question returned with more weight than ever. Not just what was happening, but how long it had been allowed to continue. The meeting with Pope Leo XIV was scheduled for 9 a.m. It began at 9:03, and by the time it ended, the Church was no longer preparing discussion. It was preparing a decree. At 9:03 the morning, Cardinal Rowe and Archbishop Fattori entered the papal office. Pope Leo XIV was already seated. There was no delay, no small talk, no ceremonial easing into the moment. He wore a simple white cassock, without decoration, and the same pectoral cross he had carried since his years in Peru. On his desk were only three things: a printed page, a glass of water, and a pen. Nothing unnecessary, nothing distracting. He looked at them and gave a single instruction: sit. They sat, and in that silence, it was already clear the conversation had moved beyond explanation. It had moved into decision. Leo did not begin with blame or accusation. He slid the printed page across the desk. It was a one-page summary, compressed, direct, stripped of detail, but heavy with meaning. The red tabs, the reports, the complaints from 22 countries, all of it reduced into structured lines that could no longer be avoided. Then he spoke. Before any action, he wanted clarity on one point. If a priest changes the words of consecration not openly, not as defiance, but slightly, gradually, perhaps even with good intentions, what happens to the Eucharist? There was no hesitation in Cardinal Rowe's answer. It could be invalid. He explained that theologians might debate thresholds, but the principle was clear. If the essential words were substantially altered, the sacramental validity was at risk. No valid consecration, no transubstantiation. The room did not react outwardly, but the weight of that statement settled heavily, because it shifted the issue from discipline to doctrine, from practice to sacrament. Leo looked down at the page again, then asked a second question, this time more concrete. If a priest had done this for 10 years, possibly believing he was being pastoral, how many masses could have been affected? No one answered. Not because they did not understand the question, but because any answer would be too large to hold comfortably. Leo did not let the silence end the thought. He moved further. What about the faithful? The people who attended Mass, received communion, trusted the Church completely? What were they receiving if the words had been altered? The room did not become emotional. It became heavier, still, measured, almost frozen in its seriousness. This was the turning point. The file was no longer a collection of administrative concerns. It was now a question of pastoral certainty, whether millions of ordinary Catholics could be confident in what they had received at the altar. Leo finally spoke again. This was not a doctrinal debate, he said. This was a pastoral emergency. That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly, because it removed every softer category the situation had been placed into. It was no longer about preference, or interpretation, or local variation. It was about urgency tied to the spiritual life of the faithful. Then he picked up the pen. Not to sign yet, but to mark the moment. He made it clear. What was needed was not guidance, not a recommendation, not another advisory letter that could be interpreted loosely. He wanted a decree, binding, clear, unavoidable. The deadline was set. Friday. 3 days. Cardinal Rowe understood immediately what that meant. The discussion phase was over. The drafting phase had begun under pressure that would not be extended. By that afternoon, the drafting team was already assembled inside a conference room in the Apostolic Palace. Cardinal Rowe chaired the session. Archbishop Fattori provided documentation structure. Father Aurelio Palmieri, a liturgical scholar, brought theological precision. Sister Benedetta Ferrara, a canon lawyer, brought legal enforcement experience. The room felt less like a committee and more like a pressure chamber, because everyone understood this text would not be read and forgotten. It would either close loopholes or expose them. And outside that room, the Church continued its normal rhythm, unaware that one of its most sensitive foundations was being rewritten line by line. Inside, the real work had begun. The first disagreement came quickly. Father Palmieri argued that the decree should begin with a pastoral tone. not to weaken it but to prevent misunderstanding. Many priests, he said, were not acting out of rebellion. They believed they were helping. They had been formed in environments where adaptation was encouraged, sometimes without clear boundaries. If the decree began too harshly, it would not correct, it would harden resistance. Sister Ferrara responded calmly, but firmly. The road to an invalid Eucharist is paved with good intentions. The room went silent, because it reframed everything, not as motivation, but as consequence. She then brought forward real cases, families uncertain about sacraments, parishioners questioning marriages, people doubting last rites, all because the words had been altered without explanation. Palmieri leaned back, absorbing the tension. The issue was no longer intention, it was trust. Rowe listened carefully, and the direction became clear. Rome had already spoken before, repeatedly, and yet the practice had continued. So the question was no longer whether to warn again, it was how to make this warning impossible to ignore. And that is where the drafting shifted completely. From that point onward, the drafting process stopped feeling like routine church administration and began resembling a controlled struggle over language, authority, and consequences. The team no longer asked, "What should we say?" They asked, "What can be written that cannot be ignored?" Father Aurelio Palmieri continued to push for balance. He insisted that many priests involved were not acting in rebellion but in confusion shaped by years of inconsistent formation. In some seminaries, he explained, adaptation had been treated as pastoral sensitivity. Priests were encouraged to make the liturgy feel closer to their communities, often without a clear explanation of where adaptation ended and unauthorized change began. If the decree spoke only in strict correction, Palmieri warned, it would create distance instead of correction. Those priests would not reflect, they would withdraw. But Sister Benedetta Ferrara did not dispute the complexity. She focused on the consequences. She opened her case files without emotion and began listing patterns that had appeared repeatedly across dioceses. Families returning home from Mass, uncertain whether the words of consecration had been properly spoken, couples questioning whether their marriage blessings were valid, and relatives unsure whether last rites had been administered correctly at a dying bedside. These were not abstract theological disputes. They were moments where people's certainty about the sacraments had collapsed into uncertainty. She closed the file and said plainly that good intention had already been exhausted as an explanation. What remained was responsibility. Cardinal Rowe allowed both positions to settle in the room before drawing the conclusion that would guide the entire document. Rome had already issued clarification. Rome had already warned. Rome had already defined limits. And yet the problem had not stopped. So this time, the text could not simply advise. It had to enforce. That single shift changed everything. The drafting team began working through the night of May 26th. Paragraphs were written, revised, discarded, and rewritten again. Each sentence was tested not only for theological accuracy but for practical enforceability. By 3 a.m., the first full draft existed. By morning, it had already been replaced. By noon on May 27th, the document reached Cardinal Parellin, the Secretary of State. And that is when the pressure shifted from theology to diplomacy. Parellin called Cardinal Rowe directly. His tone was controlled but cautious. He did not challenge the need for correction. He questioned the consequences. He pointed to regions where liturgical flexibility had already become part of ongoing synodal discussions, Germany, Belgium, and parts of South America. In those places, he warned, the decree would not be read as clarification. It would be read as confrontation. Rowe did not deny that. Instead, he changed the frame entirely. He said the issue was not perception, it was reality. Then he added something that ended the diplomatic distance in the conversation. He reminded Parellin that in parishes across the world, children were receiving First Communion without any certainty that the Eucharistic prayers had been spoken correctly. That was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of sacramental truth. The silence on the line lasted longer this time. Parellin did not object again. Instead, He asked for the final draft before it reached the Pope. Rowe agreed. The document was sent at 3 p.m. What followed did not appear in public records, but its effect became visible quickly. Parolin made 2 phone calls, one to Cardinal Reinhard Marx in Munich, another to Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich in Luxembourg. He did not instruct them. He informed them. A decree was coming. And in Vatican culture, that kind of information does not remain static. It moves. Within hours, Cardinal Marx and Cardinal Hollerich were speaking directly. Their conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. No official statement was issued. No public reaction was made. But internally, the Church had already begun adjusting to the reality that Rome was preparing something final. By the morning of May 28th, the draft was no longer just a document inside a room. It had become a signal moving through the upper levels of the Church. People now knew it existed. And once that happens in the Vatican, nothing remains neutral. Everything begins to position itself around what is coming next. Later that day, Cardinal Hollerich requested a direct meeting with Pope Leo XIV. It was scheduled for 11 a.m., and when he walked into the papal office, the conversation was no longer about drafting. It was about consequence. When Cardinal Hollerich entered the papal office at 11 a.m., the atmosphere was no longer about documents or drafts. The decree was already taking shape. What remained was the question of how it would be received, and whether it could correct without breaking trust. Pope Leo XIV did not begin with formalities. He allowed the silence to settle first, then listened as the cardinal spoke carefully. Hollerich's concern was not resistance to correction itself, it was the human layer beneath it. He explained that many priests involved were not acting out of defiance. They had been shaped by years of formation that emphasized closeness to people, adaptation, and pastoral creativity. In that environment, small changes to language had often been seen as harmless, even helpful. Some had adjusted prayers because they believed it made the liturgy more meaningful. Others had inherited practices that were never clearly corrected. In many cases, intention and instruction had never aligned properly. He made one thing clear. If the decree was too severe in tone, it risked being rejected not out of rebellion, but out of fear and misunderstanding. Leo listened without interruption. Then he stood and walked toward the window overlooking St. Peter's Square. His response came from experience, not theory. He spoke calmly, but with final clarity. The liturgy, he said, did not belong to individual priests. It did not belong to bishops. It did not belong to personalities or local preferences. It belonged to the Church, and through the Church, to the faithful. When a priest changes the words on his own authority, he does not make the Mass more pastoral. He places himself between the people and the prayer of the Church. And that, Leo said, is not adaptation. It is disruption of trust. He then turned back to the reports in the file. He asked a simple question that carried heavy weight. What about the people who had spent years attending Mass without knowing whether what they received was valid? Hollerich did not answer immediately, because there was no easy answer to give. Leo acknowledged the concern for tone. He made it clear the decree would not be written to punish, but to correct. Formation materials would follow, guidance would follow, support would follow, but the practice itself had to stop, and it had to stop in language that could not be quietly bypassed. At the door, Hollerich warned that some would interpret it as rigidity. Leo's response was steady. Clarity, he said, is not rigidity. It is responsibility. That afternoon, the final drafting session began. The same team returned. Cardinal Rowe, Archbishop Fattori, Father Palmieri, Sister Ferrara, and Monsignor Cataletti from the legal office. But the tone had changed. The debate over whether to act was over. Now it was about precision. Every line had to hold weight. The decree needed to identify exactly what could not be altered. The words of consecration, the Eucharistic prayers, the creed, the Agnus Dei, the absolution formulas, the anointing of the sick, and the marriage blessings. Nothing vague was allowed. Vagueness, they agreed, was how the problem had survived. Sister Ferrara ensured that accountability pathways were included. If a parishioner reported persistent liturgical abuse, the local diocese had 60 days to respond. If it failed, the case could be escalated directly to the dicastery for divine worship. It was not symbolic anymore. It was procedural enforcement written into law. By the evening of May 28th, the final draft was completed. Cardinal Rowe reviewed it twice in silence before calling the Pope. "It is ready," he said simply. At 8:23 p.m., the document reached Pope Leo XIV. He read it once from beginning to end. Then he read it again, slower. He made two small but decisive changes. In the opening line, he replaced the word concerned with grieved. One belonged to administration. The other belonged to shepherding. In the final section, he replaced obligated with entrusted. That shifted the meaning from command alone to sacred responsibility. Then he set the pen down. He did not sign that night, not out of hesitation but discipline. The decision had already been formed through months of reports, warnings, and accumulated silence. The signature would not create it. It would only make it public. At 9:02 a.m., on the 29th of May 2026, Pope Leo XIV signed the decree. Its title read, Servo Iesti, guard what you have received. Within hours, it was published globally. By afternoon, it had been analyzed in multiple languages. Some called it a long overdue correction. Others called it too strict. Many simply waited to see what would happen next. But in parishes across the world, something quieter happened. People began asking questions they had never felt safe asking before. Was what we received valid? Was what we were told consistent? Was the Mass we attended truly the Mass of the Church? And in Rome, a different process began immediately, not of reaction but of implementation. Within 48 hours, a 1-2-month formation program was announced for priests, along with guidance materials and a direct reporting system for dioceses. Cardinal Rowe addressed the press shortly after. When asked whether the decree marked a return to rigidity, he pointed back to the Second Vatican Council itself. No one, not even a priest, he reminded them, was ever permitted to change the liturgy on personal authority. The decree, he said, did not invent new rules. It restated old ones that had been allowed to fade in practice. By evening, the document was no longer a debate. It was a reality. In Munich, Cardinal Marx issued a brief statement affirming obedience and cooperation. In Luxembourg, Cardinal Hollerich remained silent publicly, having already spoken privately where it mattered most. And in Rome, Pope Leo XIV did not speak again, because for him, the work had already moved from signing to responsibility. On the following Sunday, in parishes across the world, something subtle but significant occurred. People listened more carefully. Priests read more precisely. And for the first time in years, the words of the Mass were no longer treated as flexible. They were treated as received. At the center of the decree was not punishment, politics, or control. It was trust, and a single instruction that now carried new weight across the Church. Guard what you have received.